Wow. Choir, India, Alex, Valerie, team, thank you guys for that worship. Yeah. If you want to get to this former New Yorker's heart, Brooklyn Tabernacle songs are the way to go. Man, what a blessing it is to be here, joint service today, just the family of God together. We realize in these moments how much we miss our college students when they're not here, the energy they give us, but we're hoping that they're safe and that they're having a good time on spring break, specifically our mission teams that are off all over the world. We pray for them. Well, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, and while you're turning there, I'll tell you a little bit about my favorite hobby in the world. I know you're probably thinking it weightlifting, right? But it's not it. I love to run, and the event of choice for me at this stage in my life is marathons, 26.2 miles. I love it. And you're like, he's crazy. Maybe a little bit. I don't know. But I love running marathons. I use it as an excuse to take road trips with my buddies. But last June, me and my friends, we met in Duluth, Minnesota to run the Grandma's Marathon. And if you know anything about marathons, 26.2 miles is a long way. And the weather plays a big deal in how much fun of a day you're going to have or how miserable of a day you're going to have. And what you normally hope for is an overcast day. You don't want the sun beating down on you, and you want it somewhere in the high 30s, low 40s is where you want it. That's not what I got in June, okay, in Minnesota. It was a hot day. There was not a cloud in sight. And just so you understand the course I was running, we were running from Two Harbors, Minnesota to Duluth, which is running west, which means sun rises in the east, and you're running straight into the sun. And so for 20-something miles, I'm just sitting there running. I'm completely exposed, just sun. And again, if you look at my complexion, I don't tend to do great in the sun, okay? Redheads, it's not my thing. Well, we're running, and I'm sitting there. I'm so tired. I'm at about mile 20. I'm just heat exhaustion. I'm sitting there thinking, can I go another step? We're at mile 20. I got 6.2 miles to go. And at this point, I'm thinking, my legs hurt. I'm tired. I've got the dried, salty sweat all over my body. My body wanted to shut down. And all I could think of was, why do I pay money to do this? Right? I've got to get a better hobby is what I was thinking. But I was thinking to myself, how am I going to make it? I got 6 miles to go and I'm struggling. And I'm sitting there, I'm just thinking one foot in front of the other, one foot in front of the other. And then finally we reached the city of Duluth. And the way the sun was kind of coming off of the buildings when we got into downtown, I noticed that there was about a 30-inch sliver of shade on the far end of the sidewalk. And I said, I'm going to get over there. And so for the last 3 miles as we're in the city, I veered over and I get into this tiny little sliver of shade, and immediately you feel the temperature just drop a little bit. And I go, I'm going to make it through. That little bit of shade on a hot day was everything I needed to help me make it to the finish. And I say all that because we've been studying the letter of 1 Peter, and Peter is writing to a group of Christians who are suffering in a hostile environment. They're suffering in harsh conditions. They're facing persecution. These are Christians that are facing persecution under the Roman Empire. We saw last week you have Christian women who are in vulnerable situations living with unbelieving husbands. In this whole letter of 1 Peter, he's addressing these Christians on how to live in harsh and hostile environments. And some of the conversations we've talked about over the last few weeks have been difficult. I'll just be honest. I felt like I'm running a marathon the last few weeks, preaching on politics, submission to authority, submission in marriage. I'm like, how much longer can I do this and keep a job? But today's passage is like shade on a hot day during a grueling endurance race. We get a respite today from some of the hard conversations, and we get some encouragement from Peter here today. Peter pauses in his letter here, and he takes a moment to encourage these Christians. I know you're facing harsh environments, but I want to encourage you today. And maybe you're here. Maybe you're facing some harsh conditions of life. Maybe there's a struggle in your life. Maybe you're just wondering, how do I put one foot in front of the other? How do I keep myself in the race? And Peter has this line in our passage today where he says, whoever wants to love life and see good days And I don't know about you, but I'm like, that's what I want. I want to love life, and I want to see good days. And Peter is writing again to people who are not on the surface, not experiencing good days. But he says, do you want to love life and experience good days, even in the midst of difficulty? And maybe you're here today and you're going, life is hard, but I want to love the life I have and I want to see good days. And Peter tells us that this is possible no matter the circumstances we face. And he gives us some basic instructions for loving life and seeing good days. And he gives us 4 things. Seek peace, or be a blessing, expect suffering, live with irresistible hope, and keep the main thing the main thing. Look at what he says in 1 Peter verse 3. He says, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. And then he quotes Psalm 34. He says, for whoever desires to love life and see good days. Anybody? Yes, I want that. Let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. How do we love life and see good days? First thing Peter says is you live a life that blesses others. Bless others. He says in verse 8, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. So, sociologists and researchers today are realizing that over the last 70 years, and this doesn't take a PhD to see, most of us see this as well, our culture has made a seismic shift in how we view ourselves and how we view others. What we live in is a culture of what sociologists call radical individualism. David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, he says we now live in a big me culture where we are all conditioned to feel as if the world revolves around me. We have not the we phone, not the us phone, we have the iPhone, right? It's mine, it's my phone. We have algorithms that feed us content specifically tailored for us. So if you get on Facebook, it's going to give you news stories that the algorithm knows that you're going to respond to. You get on TikTok, you got an algorithm that says this is what you need to see, your interest, everything is being fed to you. Netflix, Spotify, here's what you like, here's what you want. See, everything is tailor-made for the individual these days, and that has a formative effect on how we view ourselves. We view ourselves as the center of our worlds. Everything revolves around us, and it has effect on how we view others. They're just, they're just supporting cast members in the story of my life. In the last 2 decades, researchers have noticed that narcissism has risen over 30%. Among all generations. That's not just young people, but that's all of us. And listen, we all know this is true. This is killing us. This self-centeredness, the radical individualism, it is killing us. I don't think it's a coincidence that levels of anxiety and depression, levels of political polarization, all of those things have risen as we as a culture have become more and more selfish. And the more focus we place on ourselves, the more disconnected we become from others, and the more disconnected we become from others, the more disconnected we become from how God designed us and wired us. And Peter encourages us to live in a better way. He says, you want to love life and see good days? Don't live your life selfishly for yourself, but live your life as a way that blesses others. And Peter lists out these qualities that are desirable, that he says if you show these qualities, you will experience a blessing and you will experience the good life. Unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, tenderheartedness, humble-mindedness, humility. This is the spirit that should characterize the church and should characterize each of us in the room. We should be unified, sympathetic, loving, tender-hearted, humble. This is what we should all strive for. And what does this all mean? What does it mean to be unity of mind? Other translations say like-minded. And you go, yes, the church should be unified. We should all be like-minded. And that sounds so nice, doesn't it? Sounds all warm and fuzzy. Ooh, we should be unified. But that's a lot harder than it sounds, isn't it? The very fact that Peter commands the church to be unified means that it doesn't come naturally. Think about the fact, Jesus' last meal with his disciples, you know what he was going on and on about? Fellas, be unified. Why? Jesus, Peter, why are they hammering this point home? Because they know that unity does not come naturally. In Peter's day, you had Christians from all over the empire, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia. They're all coming together, Jews, Gentiles, slaves, free people with various political affiliations, male and female. And when you have people from different cultures and different backgrounds with different perspectives and different generations and all these things, it creates tension. And sometimes being in a church where people are different from you, let's be honest, it's frustrating. Because they don't like the music you like, they dress differently, they talk differently, they keep wanting to change things, they never want to change anything, right? You think, man, I could worship so much easier, and this church would be so much greater if everyone just agreed with me. Peter says that's not the goal of the church. The church is not to be a place where every person thinks the exact same on every issue. That would be called a cult, right? Not a church. The church is a place where a diverse group of people can come together and be united over something that is greater than and outweighs their differences, which is Jesus. Be unified, unity of mind. This is what we strive for. Be sympathetic. Peter says, be sympathetic. Sympathy means that you feel something alongside someone else. Romans 12:15 says, we rejoice with those who rejoice and we weep with those who weep. That's the sign of maturity. That you can grieve with someone. That you have the humility and the maturity to enter into someone's pain and feel what they feel. And sympathy requires that you not be selfish. It requires that you seek understanding, that you ask questions. How do you feel? How does this make you feel? Why does that hurt? We talked about politics a few weeks ago, and I mentioned that we all have different perspectives that we bring to every issue, right? And some of us view issues from different vantage points. And one of the things I mentioned was, I said, someone who is handicapped, for example, or someone who is raising a disabled child looks at something like Medicaid laws very differently than somebody who's not in that situation. And I had somebody in the church, they were talking, they said, that was interesting for me to hear. I had never considered, and they knowing that I have a special needs child, they said, I never thought that you would look at Medicaid from a certain vantage point because of the situation you're in. And I thought that was very kind of that person. Listen, I don't care if that person has the same opinion that I have over Medicaid policy, but it meant a lot to me that for a moment they said, you know what, I'm just taking a moment to think of what it might be like in your shoes. See, that kind of sympathy, you feel loved when people are sympathetic towards your pain. When somebody says, hey, I've never been through that, but boy, I imagine that's hard. And I can imagine that would make you scared or nervous or whatever. So let me ask you, do you have the humility to be sympathetic toward another person? When there's a disagreement with someone, when you have a disagreement with someone or someone sees things differently than you, how quickly do you jump to making assumptions about their motives? Or how much time do you take to consider their perspective? Be sympathetic. Peter says this is the path to loving life and seeing good days. Then he says brotherly love. Now in the New Testament, there's several Greek words for love. The two that are applied to the church are agape and philos. Agape is a Christ-like sacrificial love, a love where you're willing to die for someone. Philos, City of Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. That's a brotherly love. In the church, we are called to both agape, meaning sacrifice for. We are called to agape one another, and we're called to philos one another. Now, I confess, I don't know if this is true of you guys. It is easier for me to be willing to die for some people than it is for me to like them. You know what I'm talking about? I will sacrifice myself for a lot of people, but to actually like some people is hard, isn't it? It's easier to give yourself up for somebody than it is to like everybody. And most of us, we can become stubborn, narrow people without much effort. It doesn't take a lot of work to be stubborn and narrow, does it? It comes naturally. We like the things we like the people we like, and we ignore the rest, right? Brotherly love, however, it's not just that we die for one another, we would be willing to sacrifice for one another, but that we're willing to stretch for one another. They're willing to be flexible for one another. So when I met my wife, Rebecca, I did not care a thing about musicals, okay? Didn't care a thing about musicals. I was like, that's for her, not for me. But listen, I wanted to get close to that girl. So I said, yeah, I like musicals. Yeah, definitely. Let's go. So we went, I took her on a date, Fox Theater in Atlanta. We saw a musical. And here's the thing. I went along with it, and I keep taking her on dates to musicals. We moved to New York. We were going to Broadway all the time. And guess what? We love musicals now. We love musicals. Because I had to stretch in order to have a relationship with her. And what happened was I was changed in the process, and I developed a new love. That's what happens when we stretch and are flexible for one another. And listen, there is nothing more unpleasant than a person who is unwilling to be flexible for other people, isn't there? Man, the more rigid you are, the more unpleasant you are to be around. Come on. Be tender-hearted and be humble-minded, Peter says. When Peter says tender-hearted, that's a word for compassionate. And he's not talking about southern niceties. Bless their heart. That's not compassionate. He's talking about caring deeply about others, entering into their pain, giving. To be humble-minded is to know that you are needy and that you need others. To be humble-minded means that you look at others not as a threat, but as a blessing to you. As people who can bring life and joy into your lives, not people who are that threaten you. And Peter says all these things, sympathy, brotherly love, tenderness, humility, all of these things are ways of blessing others. And when you do these things, he says, then you obtain a blessing. How many of us were like, man, I just want a blessing? Peter says right here, he says, if you want a blessing, be a blessing to others. Because what comes back to you when you're a blessing to others, that is the true blessing. Those who bless are the ones who receive the greatest blessing. At my previous church in Brooklyn, I had a friend named Chris Nicholas. He died in 2022. In fact, he died the weekend that I was here preaching in view of a call. If I've ever known anyone who lived out these verses, it was Chris. Chris was one of those guys, his personality was just electric. Not in a self-absorbed, look at me kind of way, but when he walked in the room, he radiated a joy that was just contagious to everyone there. When he walked in the room, he saw every single person. There was no stranger to him. There were no people that were beneath him. He smiled. He was kind. He spent 50 years of his life volunteering with ministry to teenagers in Brooklyn. He served on the board of multiple missions organizations. His life was a life that was lived to bless others. And when he died at 73 years old, his funeral, there was not an empty seat in the house. And one of my favorite stories of Chris, one of my favorite memories of Chris is to understand Chris, you got to understand kind of who he was. He was a pretty high-class kind of guy. Princeton undergrad, Harvard Law School. He was an attorney for the New York Jets. Very successful guy. He was a major donor to the Metropolitan Opera, so much so that in his hospital, he had a long battle with cancer. I'd be sitting with him in the hospital, and singers from the Metropolitan Opera would just drop in and would sing in his hospital room. I mean, this is the kind of guy he was. He was a large donor to the Gilbert and Sullivan Singers. I didn't even know what that was until I met Chris. They would come into his hospital room. All that to say, he was a pretty highbrow kind of guy when it came to music, which means, oh Lord, he hated the music we sang at our church. He hated it. It was contemporary, it was modern, it was New York, it was edgy, it was cool. And he would tell me all the time with a smile on his face, Will, I hate that music. But on Sundays, he'd be standing there with his wife singing his heart out. And after the service, he would go up to our worship leader, who was a 20-year-old kid with long hair and tattoos from his fingertips to the top of his neck, okay? And he would offer him encouragement. And he would tell me in moments of honesty, he'd say, Pastor, I do not like the music, but those are my friends up there singing. And he said, I just love seeing young people excited about Jesus. That's what Peter was talking about. My friend Chris, he loved life and he saw good days because he didn't walk into a room expecting everybody to serve him, but he walked into the room thinking, how can I bless those around me, even if doesn't fit all the things I like. And the blessing comes back to him because I started telling our worship leader, you better sing a hymn every week just for Chris, right? See, the blessing comes back. We bless others. Third thing, we expect suffering. You expect it. He says in verse 13, he says, now who is there to harm you if you're zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. So what does it look like? How does someone love life and see good days? Many of us, we think that if I'm going to have a good life, then my life must be free from suffering. So we spend so much of our time and our money trying to mitigate pain and suffering in our lives, because what we think is the path to the good life and the path to good days is no pain and no suffering. But that's not true. And I know that that's not true for two reasons. One, some of the most joyful people I've ever met are those who have suffered greatly. And two, if the good life is contingent upon experiencing no pain, then no one will ever have a good life, because life is hard and suffering comes for everyone. And so the question then becomes, have you prepared for suffering ahead of time? Do you expect it? All throughout the Bible, the authors of the Scripture talk about joy in suffering, and they talk about how suffering produces perseverance and it produces maturity. And it's my conviction that if you want to receive the blessings that suffering can produce in your life, you need to develop a theology of suffering, and you need to do it before suffering comes. Because if you think that you can just live life kind of blissfully ignorant of what suffering's like, and then when it shows up in your life that you're going to be able to develop a theology of suffering on the fly, you got another thing coming. It's not going to happen like that. You need to be prepared for it. I remember about 15, 20 years ago, I was a young adult, college student, and I was really into the preaching of a guy by the name of Matt Chandler. Jonathan used to work be on staff at Matt Chandler's church. Matt, years ago, he was a young 30-something-year-old pastor, was growing in influence. Everybody was listening to his sermons, and everybody's kind of all eyes were on him. And then all of a sudden, in his early 30s, he unexpectedly had a seizure one morning that exposed a brain tumor in his brain, and he had to have brain surgery, and for the next several years was on chemotherapy. And I remember, as just an onlooker, would tune in to the Village Church's website and would see videos of him preaching with a bald head and a big scar across his skull. He had no idea if he was going to live or die. And he was preaching about the goodness of God in the midst of suffering. And I remember being so moved by Chandler's joy in the midst of pain and uncertainty that, and by the way, he's healthy, continues to preach now. But I remember at that time in my life, I was a privileged, upper middle class kid in college, everything going great for me, never faced a day of real suffering in my life. But I remember saying to myself, if I ever go through that kind of pain, I want to stand tall in my faith. And I don't want to be blindsided by suffering or difficulty. I want to be prepared. And then years later, I remember when my son was diagnosed with disabilities. It hurt and it was hard, but I was prepared because I prepared ahead of time for the pain that was to come. And I didn't lose my faith in the suffering. my faith has actually grown stronger through my suffering. I love what Charles Spurgeon says. He says, I have learned to kiss the waves that throw me against the rock of ages. So what I want you to understand and what Peter's trying to tell us is you got to expect suffering. You can be naive if you want, and you can just assume that pain only happens to other people and that I'll be fine. But if you do that, you're going to be blindsided when suffering does enter your life. And on that day, you'll be like Job's friends who said, why don't you just curse God and die? You'll become bitter and you'll become angry with God. But if you prepare for suffering today, like Peter encourages us, you'll be like Job, who said, though he slay me, yet I will worship him and I will place my hope in him. You see, this is the good life, one that cannot be shaken by suffering. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. Jesus was preparing his followers, but he said, when that day comes, I want you to remember, take heart, because I've overcome the world. Prepare for suffering today so that you won't be surprised tomorrow. If we expect suffering, we can endure in the midst of it. And then, not finally, sorry. Don't get too comfortable. Live with contagious hope. Peter says, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Now, we often use this passage to say, oh, we should know what we believe. We should know how to argue for it, and we should be able to give a reason for what we believe. And what we do is we often take this passage and we make it all about studying theology and apologetics. And I'm all for apologetics and theology. Beth Haney's got a class going on right now on Sunday mornings. We're all for apologetics. But notice this passage is not primarily concerned about Christians having all the right answers. It's concerned with Christians living their lives in such a way that their lives provoke questions. Peter says, be ready to give an answer when someone asks, what is the reason for all the hope you have? Peter doesn't say, know all the answers so that you can hit people over the head with all the knowledge you have. Peter says, live in a way so that when people ask you, what is the hope that you have? You're able then to tell them that the hope you have is Jesus. Leslie Newbegin was a theologian and missionary. And he said, we must live in such a way that it provokes questions for which the gospel is the only answer. He said, it is less important to ask a Christian what he or she believes about the Bible than it is to inquire what he or she does with it. What about your life causes people to say, where does that come from? What about your life causes people to ask, where does that hope stem from? I remember reading a book a few years ago by Larry Taunton. He was a friend of Christopher Hitchens. If you know who Christopher Hitchens is, he was a famous atheist. He died about, I think, maybe 10 years ago. And Christopher Hitchens was one of those atheists that was kind of mean about it. He was always on television, kind of spouting stuff. Well, in the latter years of his life, him and this guy named Larry Taunton, they traveled, they went on tour together, and they would debate Christianity. And there's no evidence, Larry Taunton says, that Christopher Hitchens had any kind of deathbed conversion. But Larry Taunton said that in the final weeks and months of Christopher Hitchens' life, he was beginning to ask questions about Larry's faith. And he would say, Larry, how can you be so calm when life is so difficult? Larry, why did you adopt? What would lead you to adopt a special needs child from Russia? And when life is difficult with that special needs child, how do you stay so steadfast? Christopher Hitchens was asking these questions, and Larry, he just says, I pray that something clicked within Christopher Hitchens as he saw my life. I pray that he saw something worth believing in. Historians have always been interested in how Christianity grew rapidly in the Roman Empire under persecution. Have you ever wondered that? Like, how did the church blow up as a minority under persecution? How in the world do you attract followers when all your followers are being persecuted? Like, what's that sales pitch look like? Come follow us and you will die, you know? Well, historian Rodney Stark says the reason that early Christians were able to grow in sort of these unbelievable ways is, he said, they lived with a contagious hope. And people were drawn to them. He said there were really three factors that made the early church grow. One was multi-ethnic unity. He said within the church you had people from all these different ethnicities worshiping together. And in the Roman Empire, everybody was separated and everybody was segregated, and people would say, how in the world do Jew and Gentile How do these people love one another? The other thing that caused people to be attracted to Christians were that they were radically generous. They used their money. They weren't stingy. They didn't use it for themselves, but they gave it to one another. And as the church pooled their resources together, they then cared for each other and for the poor. Emperor Julian said, those impious Galileans, they care not only for their poor, but for ours as well. The Christians were so generous toward the poor that they made the government of Rome look bad because Rome wasn't caring for their citizens as much as the church was. And then finally, the church cared for the vulnerable. There was this thing that would happen in the Roman Empire is people didn't want to have children, or males were often seen as more important than women, and so people would have female children, and they would literally just discard their children on the streets, leave them out there in the elements to die. And Christians would do things called baby raids, where they would literally run through the streets and they would take these children that were left to die and they would adopt them and raise them as their own. And the onlooking world saw these people, even though they were being persecuted, they saw their generosity, their unity, and their compassion, and they said, how can I get in on that? Let me ask you, does the way you spend your money, your time, and your life provoke questions from your neighbors for which the only answer is Jesus? That's the good life, church. To live in such a way that provokes questions in which the gospel is the only answer, to have a contagious hope in your life. And then finally, I mean it this time, keep the main thing the main thing. Peter closes this whole thought. He says, listen, for Christ suffered once for our sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. Peter is reminding these Christians, hey, look, amidst all the turmoil, amidst all the uncertainty, keep your minds fixed on the main thing. There is something greater than your suffering. There is something greater than your uncertain futures. There is something greater than whatever squabbles that are happening within the church at the time. He says Jesus has paid it all so that he can bring you life. And listen, church, on the days where we're tempted to grumble and moan and complain about our circumstances, on the days where life is difficult and it feels like we're running a marathon into the hot sun, and we're not sure how we're going to keep putting one foot in front of the other, Peter says, here is some shade for your weary soul. Christ has died, Christ has risen, and Christ will come again. You can endure, you can thrive, you can love life and see good days because Jesus has paved the way for you to experience life and to live forever with him. Because the grave is empty, you can endure. Because he lives. It's been a while since I sang. I can face tomorrow because he lives. All fear is gone because I know he holds. Lord, would you give us life and good days? God, I pray that we would heed Peter's encouragement to us, God, that we would bless others with our lives, that we would prepare our hearts for suffering, that we would live with a hope that causes people to ask questions, God, and I pray that we would keep the main thing the main thing. God, I pray that we would be a church that demonstrates this. I pray that the people who make up Calvary Baptist Church would be a group of people who love life and experience good days. And so, Lord, I pray that you, as we live obedient to you, would you give us the blessing that you promise here? And it's in your name we pray. Amen. I want to invite you to stand. We're going to sing a song of response. Some of you might be in a painful stretch of life. And I want to invite you, this altar is open. I'm here. I would love to pray for you. And maybe you just need to come and you just need to ask God to help you to love life and see good days in the midst of pain. Some of you are here. Maybe you need to confess. Maybe you need to confess that perhaps you've been selfish. Maybe you've looked down on others. You've counted yourself as more important. Maybe after the service is over today, you need to pick up the phone and you need to call, you need to reconcile with someone. You need to apologize. Whatever it is, maybe you just need to confess that you haven't lived as a blessing to others, but you've lived for yourself. Maybe some of you are here and you're cursing God for your suffering. You're growing bitter and you're growing angry and you're losing the faith and your feet feel like they're slipping, not on solid ground. Maybe you need to come to this altar and just ask the Lord to strengthen you, to place your feet upon the rock. As we sing, I just want to invite you to come. However the Spirit leads, would you just come and confess to the Lord what it is you need from Him to love life and see good days. So you come as we sing.